There are soldiers in the Imperium who survive their first campaign and are praised as lucky. There are those who survive 5 and are quietly watched. And then there are those who survive too many. Men and women whose names never appear in triumphal histories, whose medals stop arriving, whose commanders begin to speak to them with a careful distance they do not offer to others. These are not heroes, they are liabilities, because the Imperium can forgive failure, but it does not forgive memory. To survive one war is to obey. To survive many is to notice patterns no one wants acknowledged, orders that arrive too late on purpose, reinforcements that never come, victories that cost more than defeats. The longer a guardsman lives, the more the galaxy teaches them things that cannot be unlearned. And eventually, the Imperium must decide what to do with a soldier who has seen too much and still refuses to die. If you've marched through these stories before and felt something linger after the last words faded, then you already understand why they matter. If you want more journeys into the quiet, uncomfortable corners of Warhammer 40K, where survival itself becomes a curse, then lend this channel your support by liking the video, sharing it with someone who listens closely, and subscribing so you don't lose your place in the line. The war never ends. The records just stop. The first time a guardsman survives a campaign, it feels like an accident. Not a miracle, not a reward, just a stumble backward while everything around them collapses. Survival arrives without ceremony, soaked in mud and cordite, accompanied by the taste of recycled air and burned promethium that clings to the throat long after the fighting stops. The war does not pause to acknowledge it. The Astra Militarum does not mark the moment. One day the shelling ends, the Vox grills fall quiet, and the soldier realizes they are still breathing while others are not. That is all. On the transport off-world, no one speaks of luck. The wounded groan softly in restraint harnesses. Medici servitors glide between stretchers with practiced indifference, and the survivors sit rigid in their seats, armor still flecked with someone else's blood. The air smells of antiseptic and old sweat. Somewhere down the line, a commissar recites a brief prayer over the dead, words spoken quickly, efficiently, as though lingering might invite questions. The guardsman listens, head bowed, trying to remember names that already feel distant. Faces blur together, voices dissolve into a single memory of shouting drowned beneath artillery. At first, survival earns approval. Back on the staging world, replacements look at the veterans with something close to awe. These are the ones who made it through, the ones who didn't break. Rations are shared more generously. Questions are asked in hushed tones during brief lulls between drills. What was it like? How bad was it really? The veterans answer carefully, trimming their stories down to manageable shapes. They talk about weather, about equipment failures, about holding a line long enough for extraction. They do not talk about the moment when the sky caught fire or the way the ground shook like a living thing. They learn quickly which truths make people uncomfortable. The second campaign comes sooner than expected. Orders always do. The regiment is still under strength, its losses noted but not mourned, and the war does not wait for replacements to arrive in full. The guardsman boards another transport, the interior dim and humming, the walls scarred from older journeys. This time, survival feels less accidental. Reflexes sharpen without conscious effort. The body moves before thought, ducking as last fire scorches the air, hitting the dirt seconds before impact zones erupt. Fear becomes something quieter, a low pressure behind the eyes rather than a scream in the chest. By the third campaign, the praise thins. New recruits still listen, but officers stop asking questions. Commanders look at veterans longer than necessary, their expressions unreadable. The guardsman notices small things now, how casualty numbers are adjusted before transmission, how reinforcement requests are worded to sound less urgent than they feel, how certain platoons are always placed slightly ahead of the others. None of this feels like betrayal. It feels like procedure. The Astra Militarum runs on procedure the way a body runs on blood. Survival begins to leave marks. Not the obvious ones. Those are logged, treated, stamped with approval seals, but subtler changes. Sleep becomes shallow. Silence feels louder than artillery. The smell of promethium triggers an involuntary tightening in the chest. The guardsman eats because the schedule demands it, not because hunger arrives naturally. When others joke to keep the fear away, the laughter sounds distant, like it belongs to another life. The war is no longer something that happens around them. It is something that moves through them. During a brief rotation on a supply world, the Guardsman catches their reflection in a polished bulkhead. The face looking back is thinner, harder. The eyes linger too long, as if measuring exits that aren't there. A fresh recruit nearly collides with them in the corridor, stammering an apology. The Guardsman waves it off, but the recruit's gaze follows them with open curiosity. Not admiration, not fear. Something else. As though the recruit is trying to imagine themselves surviving long enough to look like that, and failing. The fourth deployment is where the tone shifts. The regiment is reassigned to a quieter front, a world listed as pacified but never truly secure. Patrols replace assaults, long watches stretch beneath an overcast sky that never fully clears. The enemy appears in fragments, sniper fire from ruins, mines placed with patient intent, ambushes designed to test reactions rather than overwhelm. The Guardsman survives these too, not because they are stronger, but because they hesitate less. They no longer wait for orders that arrive half a second too late. That hesitation, or lack of it, does not go unnoticed. A commissar requests a brief conversation after a patrol returns with fewer losses than projected. The questions are polite, almost friendly. Where did you learn to read terrain like that? Why did you pull your squad back when you did? The Guardsman answers truthfully, because nothing in the question sounds dangerous. Experience, instinct. Too many hours under fire. The commissar nods, satisfied, but makes a small notation on a data slate before dismissing them. From that point on, survival stops feeling invisible. The Guardsman begins to sense it in the way assignments are handed down, in the careful distance officers maintain. Medals arrive later than expected. Commendations are phrased narrowly, focused on obedience rather than initiative. During briefings, the veterans are positioned where they can be seen but not heard. Their presence steadies the line, but their voices are no longer invited into planning. They have survived long enough to become useful. And usefulness, in the Imperium, always comes with an expiration date. The Guardsman feels it one night while standing watch beneath a sky bruised purple by distant fires. The war hums quietly, waiting for its next instruction. The realization settles slowly, heavier than fear. Coming back is no longer the goal. Now, it is the problem. The fifth deployment does not arrive with fanfare or warning. It slips into the regiment's schedule like a clerical correction, a reassignment stamped and countersigned without comment. The destination is a world whose name barely registers, a place categorized as strategically stable, its surface marked by manufactorum ruins and long-dead hive sprawls, the kind of world wars pass through and never quite leave. The Guardsman reads the briefing and feels nothing, no anticipation, no dread. Just the quiet certainty that survival here will not be counted the way it once was. On the ground, the air tastes wrong. Not poisoned, not corrupted, just stale, as though the planet itself has been breathing recycled violence for too long. Patrol routes are familiar before they are walked. Kill zones announce themselves in the geometry of broken streets. The Guardsman points these things out to their squad, and the squad listens, adjusting without question. They trust experience more than doctrine now, even if they don't say it aloud. Losses remain low. That alone is enough to draw attention. During a supply rotation, the Guardsman overhears a whispered exchange between junior officers near a Vox station. It isn't meant to be heard, but long service sharpens hearing the same way it sharpens reflexes. They've been in too many rotations, one voice says. The words are delivered without malice. They don't need it. The implication hangs heavy in the recycled air. From that point on, the atmosphere changes. Patrols are extended without explanation. Extraction windows narrow. Artillery support is delayed just long enough to test endurance. Nothing is overt. Nothing that could be logged as misconduct. But the Guardsman notices the pattern because pattern recognition is the only reason they are still alive. The war has rules. So does the bureaucracy that feeds it. They survive anyway. Not cleanly, not easily. A fragment catches their shoulder, burning hot through flak and flesh. A medici servitor seals the wound with efficient detachment, injects pain suppressants, and moves on. The Guardsman returns to duty before the numbness fades. There is no celebration, no mention of resilience. The injury is recorded, categorized, filed. Another data point added to a growing anomaly. At night, when the patrols thin and the city settles into its long, uneasy silence, the guardsman listens to the distant sounds of war continuing elsewhere. The thud of artillery like a heartbeat, the hiss of distant Promethean fires. Somewhere, a vox grill crackles with half-remembered hymns broadcast to keep morale intact. The guardsman does not sing along. They have learned that hymns are for those who still need them. New recruits rotate in and out of the unit, faces changing faster than names can be remembered. Some die quickly, some adapt just enough to be reassigned. None stay long. The guardsman remains, a constant presence in a war that treats constancy as an error. Conversations grow shorter, jokes fade. Even the squad's confidence carries an edge now, as if they sense that staying close to someone who survives too often might invite scrutiny. The next reassignment confirms it. No briefing hall, no formal send-off, just a quiet order redirecting the guardsmen to a different formation attached to a different front. The transfer papers listed as routine manpower redistribution. The unit they leave behind does not ask questions. They have learned, too, what questions cost. The new posting is worse. The regiment they join has a reputation, though no one says it openly. A history of high attrition, a tendency to be deployed where fronts are collapsing or reinforcements are delayed indefinitely. The guardsman recognizes the signs immediately. Mismatched equipment, officers stretched thin, commissars whose presence feels more like oversight than inspiration. This is not where victories are built. This is where numbers are corrected. In the first engagement, the guardsman watches an entire platoon break under pressure they were never meant to withstand. Orders arrive late. Vox channels jam at the worst possible moment. The guardsman survives by pulling back when doctrine says to advance, by dragging two others with them into cover while the line dissolves. Afterward, a commissar approaches, not with accusations, but with measured curiosity. "You adapt quickly," he says, tone neutral. The guardsman considers lying, then decides it wouldn't matter. "By living," they reply. The commissar studies them for a moment longer than necessary, then nods. "See that you continue to do so." That word again. Useful. It follows the guardsmen through the next engagements, unspoken but present. They are assigned to the hardest points, the weakest lines, the positions where survival improves outcomes just enough to justify the risk. Each time they endure, the margin narrows. The Imperium is patient. It does not rush these things. One evening, while cleaning a weapon that has outlived its expected service life, the guardsman realizes something with unsettling clarity. They are no longer surviving by chance. They are surviving because they have become predictable. To the enemy, to command, to the system itself. Their continued existence is a variable being tested, not a result being celebrated. The war has noticed them. And wars, like machines, eventually correct anomalies. As the distant thunder rolls again across the horizon, the guardsman looks out over the ruined skyline and understands that coming back was only the beginning. The real question is how long the Imperium will allow it to continue. The Imperium keeps its soldiers alive just long enough to spend them. That is not bitterness speaking. It is arithmetic. The Astra Militarum is a river of bodies flowing into a galaxy that drinks human life like water. And the only reason any one guardsman stands out in that current is because they have failed, through stubbornness or chance, to be swept away. The longer the guardsman survives, the more the war stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like a system. And systems do not like exceptions. Wear begins in small places. It starts with the way the hands tremble slightly after long hours gripping a laser gun, not from fear, but from muscle memory refusing to unclench. It begins with the way the ears ring even in silence, expecting the next concussion. It begins with taste, the metallic bite of cheap rations, the bitter tang of stimulant tablets, the faint chemical sweetness of recycled water. The body adapts to deprivation as if it were climate. The soul adapts more slowly. On a transport between fronts, the guardsman sits among others and feels separate from them without meaning to. The new recruits talk about home worlds in bright, fragile voices, describing sky colors and market scents like they can still be trusted. They speak of families as if the administratum hasn't already filed their deaths in a ledger somewhere, waiting to correct the entry later. The guardsman listens, nods at the right moments, and says little. They have learned that speaking too much about survival invites questions. Speaking too much about loss invites silence. There is a moment always when a recruit realizes this. It happens late in the cycle, when the transport lights are dim and everyone is trying to rest. Someone asks the veteran a simple question: how many campaigns have you been through? The guardsman answers honestly. The number lands like an object dropped into water. Quiet ripples spread. A few recruits stare longer than they intended. Others look away quickly, as though eye contact might cause misfortune to spread. No one says anything cruel. They don't need to. The superstition of survival is older than any doctrine. By the time they reach the next staging world, the guard's bureaucracy has already moved ahead of them. Their file is updated, their assignments adjusted, their medical clearances stamped without anyone really reading them. The system is efficient in a way that feels almost inhuman, as if the administratum is a vast cogitator that only occasionally remembers the bodies it calculates are people. The guardsman stands in line for equipment issue and receives a kit that doesn't quite match the regiment's standard pattern. A power pack of a different manufacture, boots with a different tread. A vox bead that crackles with faint static even before activation. Small inconsistencies, nothing worth reporting. But the guardsman notices because they've learned to distrust minor errors. Minor errors kill. The regiment is sent out again, this time under an officer who speaks in clipped, righteous phrases as if reciting doctrine will keep artillery from landing on their position. The plan is straightforward. Plans always are, until the first shots are fired. The guardsman listens, watches the map, and feels an old sensation tightening behind the ribs. Not fear, but inevitability. The plan assumes support will arrive on schedule. It assumes the enemy will react predictably. It assumes the Vox network will hold. The guardsman has seen enough campaigns to know what assumptions are worth. On the march to the line, the air smells of ash and engine fumes. The horizon is bruised by distant fires. Somewhere ahead, a manufactorum stack collapses slowly, its metal screaming as it twists, the sound carried by wind like an animal dying. The guardsmen adjust the strap of their pack and keeps moving. They no longer flinch at that sound. That is one of the changes no one talks about. The world can end in front of them, and their body keeps walking. The first contact comes at dusk. A sudden, precise burst of fire from ruins that had looked empty through auspex sweeps the forward scouts. 2 bodies drop before anyone shouts a warning. The squad scatters into cover. Vox calls overlap in frantic fragments. The officer demands formation discipline. The guardsman ignores the order and drags a recruit behind a broken wall just as a second volley hits where they had been standing. The recruit's breathing is ragged, eyes wide, fingers clawed white around their laser gun. The guardsman does not tell them to calm down. Calm is not something you order. It is something you either have or do not. Instead, the guardsman speaks quietly, close enough to be heard over the chaos. Breathe. Count. The recruit obeys because there is nothing else to hold on to. The firefight ends quickly, not because the guard wins, but because the enemy withdraws. That, too, is a pattern the guardsman recognizes, a probing attack, a test, a message. The officer calls it a victory. The guardsman watches the smoke drifting between shattered halves and knows better. Victories do not feel like this. Victories do not leave the air tasting like unfinished business. That night, as the squad establishes a perimeter in the ruins, the guardsman watches the recruits settle into exhausted silence. Some whisper prayers, some stare into darkness with the stiff stillness of fear. The guardsman checks their weapon, then checks it again, not because it needs it, but because the hands need something to do. The war has trained them to fill silence with preparation. In the distance, the Vox network crackles with orders and casualty reports, numbers spoken as if they are the only truth worth preserving. When sleep finally comes, it is thin and interrupted. The guardsman dreams not of home, but of corridors filled with smoke, of last fire strobing against walls, of faces turning toward them and then dissolving before names can form. They wake with their heart already racing, hand already moving toward a weapon that isn't there. A recruit nearby flinches at the sudden motion, then forces themselves to look away, as though pretending not to notice will keep them safe. Where marks the soul in these small humiliations? In the distance between who you were and what you now do without thinking. In the quiet knowledge that survival has turned you into something that doesn't quite fit among the living. And with each campaign, the gap widens. By the third week on that front, the Guardsmen no longer needed a chronometer to tell time. The war provided its own rhythm. Artillery at dawn, patrols before the heat rose, long stretches of nothing broken by moments of violence sharp enough to carve memory into bone. Time stopped being measured in hours and started being measured in absences. Who didn't return? Which voices no longer answered on the Vox? Which bunk remained empty without comment? The body adapted in ways no Medici report could fully capture. Hunger arrived less often. Pain dulled into a background pressure that flared only when ignored too long. The Guardsmen learned which injuries could be worked through and which required immediate attention, not out of bravery, but out of calculation. Limp too much and you were reassigned. Ask for help too often and your name appeared on lists that never explained themselves. Endurance became less about strength and more about invisibility. Others noticed the change even if they couldn't name it. Recruits stopped sitting beside the Guardsmen during ration breaks. Conversations tapered off when they approached. It wasn't fear in the simple sense. It was the same instinct that made people step away from damaged machinery that still functioned. Something about it felt unstable, unpredictable. Survivors carried an aura that unsettled those who still believed survival was random. A commissar began appearing more frequently during debriefings. Not the theatrical sort who quoted doctrine and watched hands hover near holsters, but a quieter presence who stood near the edges of rooms, hands folded behind their back, eyes never quite settling. The Guardsmen felt those eyes more than they heard any questions. Once, after a patrol that returned with fewer casualties than projected, the commissar asked for a brief word. "You've been deployed extensively," he said, glancing at a data slate rather than meeting the Guardsman's gaze. The question was phrased carefully, not an accusation, not praise. A test. The Guardsmen considered the answer. "It alters my response to outcomes," they said. The commissar's stylus paused for half a second, then resumed its steady movement. "Outcomes matter," he replied. The conversation ended there. No reprimand, no warning. But something shifted. The Guardsmen felt it in the next deployment cycle, when their squad was assigned a route with poor sightlines and limited extraction options. The official explanation cited necessity. The unofficial one did not need words. Survival continued, stubborn and uncelebrated. Each engagement left the Guardsmen more efficient and less expressive. They stopped shouting warnings and started moving people where they needed to be, trusting that bodies would follow motion faster than words. They stopped firing reflexively and started waiting for angles they knew would appear. The enemy learned their habits, but so did the Guardsmen. The contest narrowed into something personal without ever becoming emotional. At night, when exhaustion pressed hard enough to make the edges of the world blur, memories surfaced uninvited. Not the dramatic moments, not the ones that earned citations, but the quiet losses. A voice on the Vox cutting out mid-sentence, a hand slipping from their grip as a Medici servitor pulled a stretcher away. The sound of boots on metal decking during a transport departure, counting heads without needing to look. The Guardsmen stopped dreaming of home entirely, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer fit. Home was a place where survival had not been negotiated daily, where decisions did not carry weight measured in lives. Thinking of it felt dishonest, like recalling a story that belonged to someone else. During a resupply delay, the Guardsmen found themselves seated beside a veteran from another unit, someone with the same posture, the same economy of movement. They exchanged no names. Names were irrelevant. The other soldier glanced at the Guardsman's kit, noting the mismatched components, the worn grip of the laser gun. The veteran asked. The Guardsman answered. The veteran nodded once. The veteran's expression remained neutral. They sat in silence after that, the truth settling between them like ash. When the delay ended, they went their separate ways without farewell. There was no need. The war would decide who remained long enough to meet again. The wear on the Guardsman's soul was no longer subtle. It showed in the way they scanned rooms automatically, in the way their hands rested near weapons even during prayer assemblies, in the way they listened for things that weren't said. Faith became procedural. Duty became mechanical. What remained was not despair, but a narrowing focus. Survival stripped away everything that did not serve its continuation. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous change of all. Because soldiers who endure long enough stop believing in endings. They stop expecting rescue or resolution. They adapt to perpetual conflict in a way that makes peace feel unreal. To the Imperium, such soldiers are valuable, up to a point. They are efficient, predictable, resilient, but they are also witnesses. They remember how often wars are prolonged rather than won, how frequently sacrifice is chosen because it is simpler than strategy, how readily lives are spent to maintain the illusion of control. The Guardsman stands watch on another ruined horizon, the sky stained orange by distant fires, and feels the weight of all those memories pressing inward. Not crushing, sharpening. They understand now that wear is not damage, it is refinement. And refinement produces something that does not fit neatly back into the system that created it. Somewhere in the chain of command, that fact is being noted, and preparations are being made. The moment when orders stop making sense does not arrive with alarms or raised voices. It arrives quietly, folded into routine, disguised as another minor inconvenience in a war built from inconveniences stacked on top of each other. The Guardsman notices it during a briefing held in a prefabricated command shelter that smells of damp insulation and overheated circuitry. A hololithic map flickers at the center of the room, its image stuttering as if reluctant to commit to the truth it displays. The plan is simple. Plans always are. Advance along a shattered transit corridor, secure a manufacturing junction, hold until relieved. The timeline is tight. The support listed on the projection feels optimistic. The Guardsman studies the map without comment. Years of survival have taught them where to look, not at objectives, but at margins, distances between cover, fields of fire that look clean on a cogitator but collapse under real angles, the gap between when artillery is scheduled to lift and when infantry is expected to move. It is a narrow window, too narrow. They have seen this configuration before, though never written down anywhere official. The plan assumes luck. Luck is not doctrine. Around them, younger soldiers nod as the officer speaks. They trust the shapes on the map because they have not yet learned how often those shapes lie. The Guardsman feels the familiar pressure building behind the eyes, not fear, but calculation. If the support is late, and it will be, the first wave will take unacceptable losses. If the advance continues anyway, the corridor will become a kill lane. If someone hesitates, doctrine will call it cowardice. The plan does not allow for adaptation. It allows for obedience. The Guardsman considers speaking. The thought rises, then stalls. Experience has taught them that warnings delivered too early are dismissed as pessimism. Warnings delivered too late are recorded as excuses. They have no authority here, only memory. And memory carries no rank insignia. The advance begins at first light. The sky is a dull smear of gray, the air heavy with particulate ash that coats the tongue. The corridor ahead is a canyon of broken ferrocrete and twisted rail lines, its walls rising high enough to trap sound. The Guardsman moves with their squad along the left flank, eyes tracing angles instinctively, mind counting distances without conscious effort. Everything feels wrong in the way only long familiarity can recognize. Too quiet. Too exposed. The first artillery barrage lifts exactly on schedule. For 3 heartbeats, the corridor is silent. Then the enemy fire begins. It is disciplined, measured, and perfectly placed. Blast bolts rake the corridor from elevated positions that had not appeared on the hololith. Explosives detonate behind the advancing line, cutting off retreat. The air fills with smoke and screams, the sound compressed and amplified by the narrow space. Orders flood the Vox in overlapping fragments: advance, halt, return fire, hold position, each contradicting the last. The Guardsman does not wait for clarity. They pull their squad into a shallow recess just as the center of the formation collapses. From cover, the pattern becomes obvious. The enemy knew exactly when the artillery would lift, exactly where the line would advance. This was not a surprise. It was an invitation. The Guardsman feels something cold settle into place. Not panic, recognition. They move when they should not. They break from the advance when doctrine demands momentum. They signal their squad to shift laterally, creating space where none was planned. 2 soldiers hesitate, then follow. A third does not. The Guardsman does not look back. There's no time. Survival has stripped hesitation down to something almost mechanical. Minutes stretch like hours. When the firing finally thins, the corridor is a ruin of bodies and burning equipment. Reinforcements arrive late, as expected. Command calls the engagement a partial success, citing enemy withdrawal and secured ground. Casualty numbers are transmitted upward with careful phrasing. Losses are high, but within acceptable parameters. The Guardsman listens to the Vox traffic and feels something fracture quietly inside them. This did not have to happen. They know that with the same certainty they know how to breathe under fire. Back at the forward position, the officer debriefs the survivors with a tight jaw and rehearsed words. Praise is given for courage under fire. Sacrifice is acknowledged. The Guardsman stands at attention, armor blackened, hands steady despite the adrenaline still draining from their system. When the officer's gaze passes over them, it lingers for a fraction longer than necessary. After the debrief, a senior staff aide approaches with a data slate. "Your squad deviated from the advance vector," she says neutrally. "Yes," the Guardsman replies. The corridor was compromised. She studies the slate, then looks up. "Doctrine didn't see what was waiting," the Guardsman says, before they can stop themselves. The aide's expression remains unreadable. "Noted," she replies, making a small mark on the slate. That word again, review. The Guardsman returns to their assigned area and begins the ritual of cleaning their weapon, fingers moving automatically through motions learned long ago. Around them, the survivors speak in low voices, replaying moments they cannot change. Someone laughs too loudly, a brittle sound that dies quickly. Someone else stares at nothing. The Guardsman understands now that the war has crossed a line. It is no longer just dangerous, it is dishonest. Orders are being shaped not to win efficiently, but to produce predictable outcomes. Attrition is not a byproduct, it is a tool. And soldiers who recognize that tool for what it is become liabilities. As night falls over the ruined corridor, the Guardsman feels the weight of that recognition settle fully for the first time. Survival has taught them how to read battles before they unfold. Now, it is teaching them something far more dangerous. When orders stop making sense, it is because they were never meant to. The fallout from the corridor engagement does not arrive all at once. It seeps in through paperwork, through subtle shifts in tone, through the quiet recalibration of expectations. The Guardsman notices it first in the casualty reports. The numbers are accurate, but the language around them has been softened, shaped into something that reads less like a warning and more like a justification. Losses are described as necessary pressure. The withdrawal is framed as enemy uncertainty. The failed advance is recast as a test of resolve. No one lies outright. They simply choose which truths to elevate. Assignments change after that. The Guardsman's squad is placed forward more often, tasked with reconnaissance that borders on provocation. They are sent into zones that command claims are lightly held, only to discover resistance waiting with practiced patience. Each time, the Guardsman adjusts, adapts, pulls their people through with fewer losses than expected. Each time, the margin tightens. It becomes clear that survival itself is being measured, weighed against projections that assume a certain level of attrition. The Guardsman begins to understand the logic. Wars are not fought solely to defeat enemies. They are fought to maintain momentum, to keep supply lines justified, to validate doctrines already written. A battle that goes exactly as planned is useful. A battle that deviates too far, even toward success, creates complications. Veterans who survive long enough to recognize this pattern become irregularities in a system designed to smooth them out. During a night briefing, held under the dull glow of a lumen strip that flickers just enough to be distracting, the Guardsman hears an officer use the phrase, "acceptable losses," for the third time in as many minutes. The words land differently now. They are not abstractions, they are predictions. The Guardsman looks around the room and sees the same realization dawning on a few other faces. Older soldiers, quieter ones, people who have learned to read between orders. None of them speak. They have all seen what happens when someone names the pattern too clearly. A commissar approaches later, not during an engagement, not in front of others. It is almost polite. The Guardsman is cleaning their kit when the shadow falls across their workspace. "You've demonstrated initiative," the commissar says, voice calm. The Guardsman waits. "It can also undermine cohesion," the commissar continues. "I follow orders," the Guardsman replies. The commissar's eyes narrow slightly, not in anger, in assessment. "Be careful," he says. After he leaves, the Guardsman sits in silence for a long moment, hands resting on a weapon that has outlasted 3 replacements. They are no longer imagining the pressure. It is real now, deliberate. The system is testing how far they will bend before breaking, how many others they will pull with them, how disruptive their continued existence might become. The next operation confirms it. The objective is a relay hub controlling regional Vox traffic. Intelligence claims it is lightly defended. The Guardsman knows better the moment they see the terrain. The approach funnels infantry into overlapping fire zones. The timing assumes uninterrupted support from armored units delayed 2 sectors away. The plan reads like a casualty forecast disguised as an order. This time, the Guardsman speaks during the briefing. Not loudly, not defiantly, just clearly. This route will collapse under fire. The room goes quiet. The officer stiffens. The commissar's gaze sharpens. That is not the plan, the officer says. It's the difference between holding the hub and losing half the company, the Guardsman replies. For a moment, it seems as though the words might land. Then the officer looks at the commissar. The commissar gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Your concern is noted, the officer says. The Guardsman does not argue further. They have learned that this is the point of no return. When command acknowledges a warning and proceeds anyway, the outcome is no longer accidental. It is instructional. The assault unfolds exactly as feared. Fire from concealed positions rips through the lead elements. Vox traffic dissolves into overlapping distress calls. The armored support arrives too late to change the shape of the battle, only its ending. The relay hub is taken. The cost is severe. The Guardsman survives by dragging 3 others into cover, by retreating when retreat is not authorized, by refusing to play their assigned role in the arithmetic of loss. Afterward, the official report cites bravery, determination, success against resistance. It does not mention the warning. It does not mention the deviation. It does not mention the names of those who died before they understood why. That night, standing alone on a shattered platform overlooking the captured hub, the Guardsman feels something settle with finality. The war is not blind. It is selective. It rewards obedience and absorbs resistance. It tolerates survivors only until they begin to threaten the narrative that keeps it moving. The Guardsman looks out over the battlefield and understands that the next phase is inevitable. When orders stop making sense, and you survive anyway, the Imperium does not correct the orders. It corrects you. Reassignment is how the Imperium avoids saying goodbye. There is no accusation, no ceremony, no formal judgment passed down from a tribunal. One day, the Guardsman's name simply appears on a different roster, attached to a unit they have never heard of, bound for a front that does not make the news feeds. The transfer order is stamped with the same sigils as every other piece of paperwork that governs a life in the Astra Militarum. It is clean, impersonal, final in a way that feels almost merciful. The Guardsman reads the order twice, not because they doubt it, but because they recognize the pattern now. Veterans who survive too long are not executed. That would draw attention. They are redistributed, folded into formations where experience is still valuable but expendable. Places where survival improves outcomes just enough to justify the deployment, but not enough to complicate projections. The war does not waste tools. It uses them until they no longer serve the shape it needs. The new regiment assembles on a wind-scoured staging plane beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Equipment is mismatched, scavenged from half a dozen supply lines. Unit insignia are faded or deliberately obscured, as if identity itself has become optional. The Guardsman takes this in without comment. This is not a formation meant to endure. It is meant to hold, delay, absorb. They are briefed by an officer whose eyes never linger on any one face. The tone is practiced neutrality. Objectives are framed as opportunities. Losses are implied rather than stated. The Guardsman listens and feels a familiar tightening behind the ribs. This is not incompetence. It is design. On deployment, the environment confirms it. The front is unstable, shifting daily as enemy pressure probes for weakness. Fortifications are temporary. Supply drops arrive late or incomplete. Vox traffic cuts out without warning, replaced by static thick enough to swallow words. The Guardsman adapts, as they always have, but adaptation here feels different. There is no expectation of reinforcement, no illusion of relief waiting just over the horizon. This is a place where time is measured in how long something can be held before it breaks. The first engagement is brutal and brief. The enemy strikes with precision, withdrawing the moment resistance stiffens. The guardsman leads a counter move that saves a firing line from collapse, earning a nod from an officer who makes no note of it. Praise has no value here. Survival is assumed, not celebrated. Those who fall are replaced without comment. Between engagements, the guardsman notices who surrounds them, others like themselves. Soldiers with worn gear and quiet eyes, people who move efficiently and speak rarely. They do not exchange stories. Stories imply futures. Instead, they exchange glances that acknowledge shared understanding. They know why they are here. During a lull, the guardsman overhears a fragment of Vox traffic not meant for their channel. A logistics officer's voice, clipped and precise, discussing casualty thresholds and reinforcement timing. Sustained resistance acceptable. The words carry no emotion. They do not need it. They describe lives the way a cogitator describes fuel expenditure. The guardsman feels no anger. Anger requires the belief that something could have been otherwise. This is clarity. The Imperium has decided that long-lived soldiers are most efficient when placed where death is probable, but not guaranteed. Where survival still serves a function, but only until it does not. Orders arrive that test endurance rather than strategy. Hold positions without adequate cover, advance without armor support, delay withdrawal until the enemy commits fully. Each time, the guardsman survives by reading intent rather than instruction. Each time, their continued existence narrows the margin further. They are not meant to last indefinitely. They are meant to blunt momentum, to absorb pressure, to make space elsewhere. One night, while reinforcing a firing position with scavenged plating, a younger soldier finally asks the question no one else has voiced. He asks not accusing, just confused. The guardsman considers the honest answer, because I learned too much, because I didn't die when expected, because the war noticed me. The young soldier nods slowly, as if that answer explains more than it should. The realization settles fully then. Survival has become a conditional allowance, extended only as long as it remains profitable. The guardsman is no longer fighting to win wars. They are fighting to stabilize numbers, to delay collapse, to make sure losses happen where they can be managed. They are not being punished. They are being applied. And like all applications in the Imperium, there will come a point where efficiency demands replacement. The guardsman looks out across the front as distant fires paint the horizon in dull orange streaks. The war hums patiently, waiting for its next correction. They have survived long enough to understand what comes next. The question is no longer whether they will die. It is how quietly the Imperium will arrange it. The war slows down in places like this, stretching itself thin and wide until every hour feels borrowed. Days pass without a decisive push, yet every night brings probing attacks that test resolve rather than strength. The guardsman learns the cadence quickly. Enemy fire at irregular intervals, sudden advances meant to draw defenders into overextension, withdrawals timed to leave just enough damage behind that repairs never quite catch up. This front is not meant to be won. It is meant to exist. Command reinforces this truth without ever stating it. Requests for additional supplies are acknowledged but delayed. Reinforcement schedules remain vague. The guardsman watches new names cycle through the unit, many of them young, some already carrying the hollow stillness of people who understand where they've been sent. The veterans do what they can, positioning others where survival is most likely, sharing habits rather than hope. They are careful not to organize too visibly. Too much cohesion draws attention. One evening, as the sky darkens into a featureless smear and the wind carries the smell of distant fires, the guardsman is summoned to a command post little more than a reinforced trench. Inside, the air is warm with the hum of cogitators and the faint ozone tang of overworked Vox equipment. An officer stands over a hololithic display, its shifting lines marking troop movements that never quite align with reality. "You've been holding your sector longer than expected," the officer says without looking up. "Yes, sir," the guardsman replies. The officer turns then, studying them with professional detachment. "That won't be sustainable. We'll be rotating your unit forward tomorrow." The guardsman glances at the display. The highlighted zone is exposed, flanked by unstable ground and lacking meaningful cover. A place where holding action becomes a calculation of minutes rather than hours. The guardsman asks. The officer's mouth tightens briefly. It is not a lie. It is simply not an answer. The guardsman nods and turns to leave. At the threshold, the officer speaks again, quieter this time. The words carry no warmth. They are a formality, a closure. The next day's movement unfolds under a sky heavy with impending storms. The ground sucks at boots, thick with ash and half-burned debris. As the unit advances, the guardsman feels the pressure tightening again, that familiar sense of narrowing outcomes. They take position, establish fields of fire, reinforce what little cover exists. Enemy contact begins almost immediately, measured and methodical. This fight is different, not more violent, but more deliberate. The enemy commits in stages, testing resistance, escalating only when it becomes clear the defenders will not break easily. The guardsman moves constantly, adjusting lines, pulling soldiers back seconds before positions are overrun. Survival remains possible, but only just. Every success seems to prompt a stronger response, as though the front itself is irritated by resistance. Losses mount, not catastrophically, just enough. Between engagements, the guardsman finds a moment alone, crouched behind a barricade scarred by repeated impacts. The sound of distant fighting blends with the hiss of static on an unsecured Vox channel. For the first time in a long while, a thought surfaces unbidden. This could be the end. Not dramatically, not in a blaze of heroism, simply by accumulation, by being placed where eventually probability wins. The realization does not frighten them, it clarifies. When the next order arrives, it is delivered via a curt Vox transmission. Hold position, no fallback, no mention of relief. The guardsman relays the order without commentary. They do not need to explain. Everyone here understands what it means. The enemy attack comes hard and fast, heavier than before. Fire rains down, tearing through barricades, chewing into earth and metal alike. The guardsman fights with the same efficiency that has kept them alive this long, but the margin is gone now. Where there was once room to maneuver, there is only pressure. Where there was once choice, there is now inevitability. At some point during the chaos, the guardsman becomes aware of something subtle but profound. No one is watching anymore. No data slate is tracking their performance. No commissar stands nearby, evaluating obedience. The war has moved on to its next calculation. They are no longer useful in the way that matters. The thought arrives without bitterness. Usefulness was always conditional. What surprises the guardsman is the quiet that follows. The absence of scrutiny feels almost like freedom. When the order finally comes to withdraw, it is late. Too late for many. The guardsman helps pull survivors back through smoke and ruin, their movements slower now, not from injury, but from exhaustion that has finally accumulated beyond compensation. They reach the fallback line with fewer than they started. No commendation follows, no reprimand. The engagement is recorded as holding action complete, losses within projected limits. That night, the guardsman sits alone, helmet resting beside them, listening to the distant thunder of artillery roll across the dark. The war continues, indifferent. Somewhere, plans are already being adjusted, rosters updated, projections recalculated. The guardsman understands now that they have reached the edge of their allowance. They have survived long enough to see the shape of the system clearly, and that clarity has rendered them obsolete. What comes next is not punishment. It is conclusion. There is no announcement when a guardsman reaches the end of their usefulness, no order stamped in red ink, no tribunal convened beneath banners and seals. The Imperium does not dramatize conclusions, it files them. One day, after a night that stretches too long and a dawn that arrives without relief, the guardsman receives a new assignment that reads like a kindness: rear echelon security, garrison duty, a quiet world far from the worst fronts. The language is careful, almost gentle, as if written by someone who understands how hope works and chooses to apply it sparingly. The transport that carries them away is half empty. The seats are scarred from old use, the lumen strips dimmed to conserve power. No one speaks much. Those aboard share the same look. Bodies held together by habit, eyes that no longer search for glory. The guardsman watches the stars slide past the viewport and feels nothing like relief. Retreat is just another maneuver, and this one feels too deliberate to be benevolent. The destination is a world without spectacle. No hive spires clawing at the sky, no burning horizons. Just a broad, dust-choked plain broken by low fortifications and listening posts spaced too evenly to feel natural. The air smells of dry earth and static. This is a place designed to be overlooked, a place where people are stationed until they are forgotten. Garrison life settles into a rhythm that feels almost obscene in its calm. Patrols are routine. Equipment inspections are thorough but unhurried. Vox traffic is minimal, reduced to status confirmations and weather reports. The Guardsman finds themselves standing watch beneath an open sky for the first time in years, the silence so complete it presses against the ears. There are no artillery impacts to count time, no screams to mark distance. The war feels far away, and that distance is unsettling. Others here are like the Guardsmen, veterans who have survived too long, gathered quietly at the edge of relevance. Some wear old regimental insignia faded beyond recognition. Some have removed their markings entirely. They do not ask each other about past campaigns. Everyone already knows the answer. Survival brought them here. Survival always brings you somewhere. Rumors circulate in fragments, never complete enough to challenge officially. Some say these postings are meant to preserve experience, to train others when the need arises. Others whisper that this is where the Imperium sends soldiers it no longer knows how to categorize, not broken enough to discard, not compliant enough to trust. The Guardsman listens without comment. Rumors are another kind of ration, shared to fill emptiness, not to nourish truth. Weeks pass, then months. The Guardsman's body begins to change again, this time in subtler ways. Reflexes dull without constant reinforcement. Muscles ache in unfamiliar patterns. Sleep comes easier, but it is heavier, crowded with memories that no longer have an outlet. Without immediate danger to focus the mind, the past presses in from all sides. Names resurface. Faces return with clarity that had once been impossible. One evening, during a routine inspection, an administrative liaison arrives with a small entourage of servitors. He speaks in the language of reassignment and optimization, explaining that some personnel will soon be transferred again. His tone is neutral, his eyes fixed on a data slate that dictates his every word. When the Guardsman's name is called, it is without inflection. The new posting is described as advisory, support role, minimal risk. The Guardsman recognizes the phrasing. It is the same careful language used when something is being removed from circulation without fuss. The Imperium does not erase veterans. It disperses them until their stories cannot align. The transport for this final move is smaller, older. The Guardsman boards without hesitation. There is no one to say goodbye to. Connections here were never meant to form. As the vessel lifts off, the garrison recedes into the dust, already fading into the same anonymity it was designed to provide. During the journey, the Guardsman reflects on the arc that brought them here. Not with regret, not even with anger, just recognition. They survived long enough to understand that the Astra Militarum is not cruel. It is efficient. It does not punish survival. It manages it. The transport shudders as it enters the warp, the familiar pressure building behind the eyes. The Guardsman closes them and lets the sensation wash over them, grounding themselves in the simple fact of still being alive. For now, whatever awaits at the end of this journey will not be dramatic. The Imperium rarely wastes spectacle on those who have already served their purpose. This is the last place survivors go, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too often. The final posting does not feel like an ending at first. It feels like being set aside. The installation is small, half buried in stone and dust, its purpose vaguely defined in administratum language that never quite commits to meaning. Advisory detachment, security oversight, knowledge retention, words arranged to suggest importance without responsibility. The Guardsman arrives with a handful of others, each carrying the same quiet weight, each understanding without discussion that this is not a place meant to grow or change. It is a place meant to hold. The days pass without incident. Patrol routes trace the same lines again and again. Reports are filed, read, acknowledged, and archived. Nothing ever escalates. Nothing ever improves. The Guardsman realizes slowly that this is the design. Conflict sharpens, calm dissolves. Left alone with memory, soldiers begin to soften in ways the Imperium finds inconvenient. This place is not meant to kill them. It is meant to let them fade. Some do. One veteran stops reporting to duty one morning. A medici servitor retrieves the body from a bunk without ceremony, tags it, and wheels it away. The cause is listed as organ failure aggravated by accumulated trauma. accurate, incomplete. Another is reassigned off-world with no explanation and never heard from again. No one asks where they went. Questions require answers, and answers require records. Records create problems. The Guardsman continues to serve because habit is stronger than hope. They train newer personnel who rotate in briefly, passing on lessons stripped of context. How to move through ruins, how to listen for the moment before an ambush becomes inevitable, how to survive contact long enough for someone else to arrive. The trainees listen, nod, and then leave, carrying fragments of experience without ever knowing its cost. The Guardsman watches them go with a sense of distance that feels almost peaceful. At night, beneath a sky unscarred by artillery fire, the Guardsman sometimes thinks about speaking, not shouting, not rebelling, just telling the truth plainly. About casualty arithmetic, about orders shaped by expectation rather than necessity, about how survival becomes a liability once it produces understanding. The thought never moves beyond consideration, not because of fear, but because the Guardsman finally understands something fundamental. The Imperium does not silence truths by force. It silences them by outlasting the people who know them. Time does the rest. The Guardsman ages faster here than they did at the front. Without constant danger to outrun, the body remembers everything it endured. Old injuries ache, fatigue settles deeper, the reflex to scan exits remains, but the urgency fades. The war becomes a distant pressure rather than an immediate presence. That too is intentional. Soldiers who cannot feel the war cannot speak about it convincingly. One evening, a final message arrives on the Vox, a routine transmission wrapped in procedural language. Personnel reduction, resource consolidation, select individuals to be released from active duty. The Guardsman's name appears on the list, released. There is no celebration, no ceremony, no promise of return, just a signature line and a transport schedule. The Guardsman boards the vessel alone, no escort, no farewell. As the engines ignite, they feel a strange sensation, lighter but not relieved. For the first time in years, the Imperium has stopped watching them entirely. Their file will be archived, their service summarized in numbers, their survival reduced to a line item marked resolved. Where they go after that barely matters. A backwater settlement, a manufacturum oversight role, a quiet hab where no one asks how many wars they lived through. The galaxy is vast, and it absorbs people easily. What matters is this. The Guardsman survives the war, but not the Imperium. Not in the way stories promise. They live long enough to understand that the Astra Militarum does not need heroes forever. It needs obedience in youth, resilience in crisis, and silence in age. Those who provide all three are rewarded with obscurity. Somewhere, far away, another campaign begins. New regiments deploy. Fresh recruits step onto transports with faith intact and futures untested. They will fight. They will die. A few will survive longer than expected, and when they do, the system will recognize them. Not with praise, but with quiet precision. Because in the Imperium of man, the most dangerous thing a soldier can become is not a rebel, or a coward, or a traitor. It is a witness. And witnesses, eventually, are sent where their voices can no longer reach the war. The Guardsman looks out at the passing stars one last time, not searching for meaning, not asking for absolution, just acknowledging the truth they earned the hard way. Surviving too many campaigns was never about luck. It was about lasting long enough to see how the machine really works, and knowing that, finally, when to step out of its shadow.